Greetings temporal humans. This is your old pal Boudreaux coming at you from the rockingest little town in Iberville Parish, that place too cool for maps, Mugwump, Louisiana. Oh, who am I trying to fool? Cool human slang just doesn't work when one has a projected IQ of over 10,000. Tonight's episode of Trailer Trash Terrors is titled, Bigfoot's Grandpappy Lived Over Yonder. That was actually quite embarrassing to say. Let's see if Vic Hermansen can salvage this budding disaster.
Trailer Trash Terrors.
I wonder why he keeps calling me Vic Hermansen. You know, with an IQ of over 10,000, he should be able to figure out normal pronunciation. So, tonight we're going back at least to 1958, at first, and then a lot further in the past. But for now, come with me to September 28th, 1958. Historians generally talk about the first instance of the word Bigfoot being used as being in the Humboldt Times, September 28, 1958. A journalist named Andrew Genzoli published a letter about loggers in Northern California who were finding huge footprints around their worksite. In his article, he joked, "Maybe we have a relative of the abominable snowman of the Himalayas." He meant that article as a joke. Just a filler piece for Sunday morning. Well, he was very surprised when the community became extremely interested in that article, Bigfoot, and everything surrounding Bigfoot. By the early part of October, dozens of newspapers in California and across the nation had picked up on the article and had started writing their own articles concerning the newly found Bigfoot. I'm looking at an article in the Eureka Humboldt Standard on October 6, 1958. The headline is, "Huge Footprints Found on Wilderness Road." There's a picture of a man holding a standard Bigfoot cast, of a huge footprint, 15, 16, 18 inches long, and then with a bulldozer with the cartoon character Alley Oop walking next to it. Let me read you just a few excerpts from this article, which will soon be available on the Trailer Trash Treasures website. The resemblance of the alley-oop feet in Mr. Bigfoot's extremities is startling. However, those who actually have seen the footprints, including crew and fellow workers on the Bluff Creek Road, do not treat the strange occurrence lightly. Crew probably expressed the feeling of many people in the Wachpia Hoopa area when he said, "I tell ya, it's a strange feeling to walk along a road in that huge wilderness and suddenly see huge footprints." On their way to the job, tracks were seen going down the road. The tracks measured 14 to 16 inches in length. The toes were very short, but were 5 to each foot. The ground was soft and the prints were clear. In soft places, the prints were deep, suggesting a great weight. The tracks were wide as well as long. Things such as fruit had been missed by those on the job. If the latter is true, it seems to indicate that Bigfoot might be a vegetarian. "We often feel we are being watched," claimed Crew. He said he and the men do not feel the presence is unfriendly, since they never find any damage to their equipment. However, they always find fresh imprints on each new piece of work, as though Bigfoot has a supervisory interest in the project. Later in the article, they mention another worker there named Ray Wallace. He actually did create a big set of fake footprints and stomped around the area in the soft earth for a long time. But since the media became aware that one prankster, Ray Wallace, was on site, they tend to attribute all Bigfoot footprints to pranksters of a similar type. One of the things they have generally failed to do has been to read their own archives. There are stories of huge wild men, of hairy hermits in the woods, of 8-foot-tall men with clubs dressed in skins, going back to the 1700s in the U.S., and even earlier in Europe. It was not something that was unknown across the country. One of the problems in researching these old articles is that many papers had a very casual attitude concerning factuality. If sales were slow, if things were slow in town and boring, it was not at all beyond their capability to simply make up several extremely interesting stories meant to sell papers and to bring in tourists. But I don't think they are all like this. When you read through them, you do find some commonality. So tonight, we're going to go look at some of those old articles. I've collected a few. I know other people have done this, but I wanted to put my own spin on these fascinating old articles. Let's go have some fun.
Vic Hermansen obviously has a very unusual understanding of the word fun. What's next? Maybe greasing the trees and watching the squirrels slip off?
Okay, I suppose that in today's world, man, I hate that term, one should make a disclaimer before going through any old newspaper articles. These articles are from a different time. They were written by people who have different standards, different mores, and different ways of expressing things. I am very much a believer in those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. So I think it's valuable to see how the world has changed, as well as what was being reported back in those times. Please understand, if any of these articles have language that might today be considered racist or sexist, that they are not representative of my opinions. I just want to hear the stories as they were originally written. If you find an honest recounting of the past to be offensive, you probably should find another podcast. So, let's start with London in 1800. One of the interesting things about these old papers is that they often didn't really even utilize headlines. They would just string a bunch of stories together, and I guess it was kind of up to the reader to determine where one story ended and the next story began. So the story goes, there is now in the river an astonishingly large, hairy wild man, caught 400 miles from the Cape of Good Hope, brought over in the Rambler, a South Sea whaler. He is of astonishing muscular strength, a specimen of which had nearly proved fatal to one of the custom house officers who inadvertently went too near him. He seized hold of the man, twirled him about 2 or 3 times with the greatest velocity, and then threw him over the side. Luckily, the man escaped, with a horrid fright and a sound ducking. There's no follow-up. There's no explanation. There's no speculation as to exactly what this hairy wild man was. They just present the story like they're presenting yesterday's racing results. Back then, stories moved from paper to paper just like today, but it took weeks, sometimes months, for that information to make its way across the Atlantic to American newspapers or to Asian newspapers or wherever that story happened to go, but they would repeat the exact same story from paper to paper. There are commonalities in these old stories. So if we move up to 1810 in the Pennsylvania Gazette, there's a story that says, Wild Man. The following account of a wild man caught in the forests of Hungary has been recently published in a collection of curiosities of natural history, sent from the press in the Hungarian language. A Wallachian, who perceived the wild man seated upon a tree where he was eating leaves, caught him in a spring, and afterwards shooed him for money. The wild man appeared to be of the age of 24 or 25, and had his back and chest entirely overspread with a thick covering of hair. His skin was a dark yellow. He expressed only confused cries and a sort of murmur. He became melancholy at the sight of a forest or garden, and fought to hide himself in such places. After being kept 2 or 3 years in captivity, he began to eat dressed meat, and from that moment his manners became less savage, and his body, losing a considerable portion of its hairy covering, became less yellow. He was quite civilized, and performed the office of a water carrier, but never advanced so far as to be able to speak words and sentences in succession. And again, that's the limit of the story. No follow-up, and the frequent use of the word wild man. Another aspect of these stories that I find interesting is that they seem to have the belief that these were men, and as men lived out in the forests, or they lived out in the wilds, they would develop a furry, hairy coat, which would, of course, would fall away when they came back to civilization. They generally also talk of the tremendous size of these wild men, often being 7 to 8 feet tall. Sometimes they use some pretty unique and interesting words and terminology. This story is from 1818, from the Alexandria Gazette in Virginia. The story reads, "Reports say that in the vicinity of Ellisburg was seen on the 30th of last month by a gentleman of unquestionable veracity an animal resembling the yoho, or wild man of the woods. It is stated that he came from the woods within a few rods of this gentleman, that he stood and looked at him, then took his flight in a direction which gave a perfect view of him for some time. He is described as bending forward when running, hairy, and the heel of his foot narrow, spreading at the toes. Hundreds of people have been in pursuit for several days, but nothing further is heard or seen of him. The frequent and positive manner in which this story comes influences us to notice it. We wish not to impeach the veracity of this highly favored gentleman, yet it is proper that such naturally improbable, if not impossible, events should be established by the mouth of at least 2 or 3 eyewitnesses, to entitle them to credibility. This is another aspect of these stories. They always refer to the people reporting the wild man as being of unimpeachable character or unquestionable veracity. I wonder sometimes if that was written sincerely, or was it some kind of sarcastic code for, hey, this guy is trying to pull our leg, but we're going to play along. Did you notice that in this last story, they refer to the wild man as a yoho? That word yoho, or yahoo, depending on where you read it, seems to have come from Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. If you read through some of the literature of the day, you can find it. I found something written by Kurt Morse. He's talking about a cove called Yoho Cove, and this is what one of the neighborhood people said. "Cove about 2 miles below where I live called Yoho Cove, and the old fellas years ago allus said there was some kind of a wild man lived there, and all they could understand he holler, yo-ho, yo-ho, all the time, especially at night. So he kind of slacked off, and there was some of the natives down around the shore, don't you know, and took kind of a dugout canoe. I call it a dugout of tree. Went across there raspberrying. Well, they got about ready to come home, and this big old critter, hair all over him, came out screaming, yo-ho, yo-ho. They knocked him down and stole their berries. I'll tell you, those boys got in that canoe and got out of there right quick." In one of his diaries, Daniel Boone talks about meeting and killing a yahoo, as he called them, but what he described was clearly a Bigfoot, something 7, 8 feet tall, covered in fur, huge feet, smelly, stinky, aggressive, Now, Daniel Boone was certainly not above adding interest to his diaries by simply making up stories. But still, it's part of history, and I guess there's always the off chance that Daniel Boone really did kill a yoho. I think if you're going to actually try to study this topic, which I think is worth studying, you need to understand that these creatures have existed in folktales for hundreds of years. This is from Kentucky, and they're using the name Yaha. Once upon a time, there's a man laying out, and he went to a cave, and he was laying out in there, and the Yaha came and throwed a deer into him. Something would come in every day and throw a deer into him and leave out. One time, that Yaha got down in there with him, and not long after that, she had a kid. Then one time, he took a notion to leave her and go to leave, and she wouldn't let him go. She'd make him come back. Finally, he got out and got on a ship going to cross the waters, and he got started and rode off and left her. And she stood there and hollered and screamed after him, and when she seen he'd got away from her and she couldn't go, why, she tore the baby in two and throwed him half in after him. Now that's one pissed off yoho. One of the issues in reading these old stories and trying to glean what information one may concerning this overall phenomenon is the fact that they use some very odd terminology. In the current Bigfoot world, there are different ideas as to what Bigfoot look like. Some people think of them as having separate species. One species might be the paddy-type creature, huge, robust, 7 feet for the females, 8 feet for the males, covered in thick, heavy hair. Another might be something that looks close to a large chimpanzee. Another one that is reported is something that's built kind of like a larger Tyson Fury with much more sparse hair. Then they talk about dogmen. Well, you can find references to what seems to be dogmen in these old papers, too. This next article, which I'm only going to read a small part of and then paraphrase the rest, was in the Allentown Democrat, Friday, February 13th, 1914. The small headline is, "Fear the Mountain Devil. Old hunters believe firmly in odd animals' existence." Now, the overall tenor, the overall tone of the story is ridiculing those who believe in the existence of the mountain devil. But after a while, here's how they describe what it looks like. "For my own part, I have seen but one mountain devil. It was dead. Billy Newman and myself, while at Alwaco near Shoalwater Bay, were invited to call at Jawbone's saloon and inspect the carcass and give our opinion as to the kind of varmint it might be. The proprietor informed us that it had been shot out of a tree about 70 feet from the ground in the mountains back of the bay, that it was an active tree climber, but absolutely fearless, and when shot, was preparing to descend to attack its enemies. It was a plantigrade animal of enormous size, and its hair much resembled that of the cinnamon bear, but here all resemblance to the bear family ceased. Its legs were long and straight, its back was straight as a wolf's, while the body and head much resembled the hyena. Well, that's a walking dog. Shot in 1914, somewhere in the mountains back of the bay." There was also not absolute consistency in the way that these words were used from paper to paper. This is from the Herald, Miami, Florida, Thursday, July 17th, 1924. The headline is, "Searchers After Mountain Devils." This one is from Kelso, Washington. "The hope of bagging gorillas on the slopes of Mount St. Helen has been revived among local hunters with the return here of persons who have visited the cabin near Spirit Lake, where the Smith Beck prospecting party claimed it was attacked by mountain gorillas." Here, of course, they're talking about Ape Canyon. They're talking about those hunters who apparently shot a Bigfoot, a mountain devil, a man-ape, something up there, and it fell into some huge ravine. That night they were attacked by many of these creatures, and indicate that they only survived because of the incredible strength and resilience of their cabin. These returning investigators declared that on the first floor of the cabin, they found rocks, which, according to the Smiths and their partners, were hurled there by the mountain devils. In other papers, they acknowledge the existence of mountain devils, but insist that they are nothing other than wolverines. Well, these stories aren't talking about wolverines. They're talking about either dogmen or Bigfoot. Now we go to the Paducah Evening Sun, Paducah, Kentucky, Thursday, July 17th, 1924. The headline reads, "Seek Habitat of Ape Men Roaming Through Washington. Parties go out to probe strange reports of mountain devils. Men 8 foot tall and with hairy bodies. Parties report big stones hurled into cabin by wild crew." In this article, we hear and we see debunking at its finest. Kelso, Washington, July 17th. The tale of the tall gorilla men, or as some call them, the mountain men, or mountain devils, or ape men, who were credited with having attacked a party of trappers in the mountains here last week, is a hoax, is a myth, 2 forest rangers declared. Today, these rangers, J.H. Huffman and W.M. Welsh, who investigated the stories brought back by the trappers, said that the stones that had been reported to have been thrown at the cabin were in fact hauled by human hands. The local Native American tribe was called the Klallam Indians, and they talk about these creatures as having a name Siatik. They report them as being 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in hair, immensely strong, and capable of easily imitating birds. The Siatiks are 7 to 8 feet tall, with hairy bodies like bears. They are great hypnotists and also have a gift of ventriloquism, throwing their voices great distances. The Klallam people, as seems to be the case in many of these old stories, simply regard these mountain devils or ape men, these immense hair-covered beings, as being simply another tribe of Indians. They do seem to say that they have some powers, like the ability to hypnotize anyone who sees them, or to make their voices seem to come from far away, from some other location in the forest. These are the same stories we hear from witnesses today. Now, I'm not saying that witnesses are all telling us the truth or have actually seen anything, but I do find the consistency in these reports to be sort of remarkable and very much, at least, fascinating. The stories like today are not limited to one part of the nation. They come from everywhere. Here's one from the North Adams Transcript, North Adams, Massachusetts, 23 August 1895. The article's headline is, "Built Like a Horse. Wild Man Creates Terror Among Farmers Around Engine Meadow. He Scares Brutes as well as human beings. Posse to organize and to make a determined effort at capture. The wild man lives in Engine Meadow, as it is known to the countrymen. He is thought to be one of a family of 3 wild men seen 2 years ago. The man seen by Mr. Smith has no clothes, yet was covered with thick hair. The wild man seen in Canaan Mountains a few months ago is thought to be the same person." In most of these articles, it's just simply assumed that we're dealing with a person. They never seem to think of this as being some other kind of hominid or primate. It's just an unusual human in most of these articles. Mostly, it seems, these people, or creatures, are thought of as being violent. On Saturday, Rowley Smith, while coming over the road, stopped to pick a few berries, but no sooner had he commenced to eat them than the wild man emerged from the center of a batch of berry bushes. Smith was about scared to death. His dog commenced to whine, and with its tail between its legs, sought refuge in Smith's wagon under a pile of blankets. Mr. Smith described the man as an awful-looking sight. He is large in stature, and his head is the most conspicuous part of his body, being nearly the size of a horse's head. His teeth resemble those of a horse in size, but are pointed. His hands are extra large. The feeling I get in these stories is that the journalist actually has no idea what they are writing about. They don't seem particularly incredulous. They don't seem to really believe. They're just reporting what they hear. So, I'm going to speculate that journalists in 1896 were far more skilled than journalists in 2022.
Vic Hermansen, we in the cyber world also have a terrifying wild man. He seems to have no morals and lives only for wanton destruction. His name is Mark Zuckerberg. Brr. Just speaking the name gives me cold chills, and makes me shiver.
These stories continue as we move into the 20th century. And by 1930 or 1940, a great many of them are centered in Canada. Here's a story from the Salinas Daily Post, dated Friday morning, October 11th, 1935. The headline reads, "Lost race of hairy monsters again found roaming rocky Canadian hills." In this case, they discuss these creatures as being just an accepted fact. Sasquatch men, remnants of a lost race of wild men who inhabited the rock regions of British Columbia centuries ago, are reported roaming the province again. After an absence of several months from the district of Harrison Mills, 50 miles east of Vancouver, the long, weird, wolf-like howls of the wild men are being heard again, and 2 of the hairy monsters were reported seen in the Morris Valley on the Harrison River. The article goes on to talk about these creatures as being nimble as goats, able to jump down from craggy peaks with no danger to themselves. It talks about them straddling a log and moving it through the water very quickly with their massive hands. People who have reported seeing the giants on their rare appearances describe them as ferocious-looking wild men, 9 feet tall, and covered from head to toe with thick, black hair. Here's a very detailed article from the St. Louis Daily Globe and Democrat, Sunday morning, July 28, 1895. The Wild Man of the Hondo. A Texas district terrorized by a naked monster. He carries an enormous club and takes delight in frightening children and women. All efforts to capture or kill him have failed. Kerrville, Texas, July 24th. For nearly 2 years, southwestern Texas has occasionally been agitated by rumors of a wild man who inhabited the mountains of the Hondo and the Medina. Recently, this monster has been frightening women and children and creating consternation among the settlers and cowboys. About 2 months ago, a Mrs. Anderson, the wife of a rancher living on the headwaters of the Medina, was driving in a buggy with her 2 little children along a lonely mountain pass a little after sundown, when near her home she was suddenly confronted by a naked giant who sprang into the road in front of her horse, making savage gestures and yelling like a Comanche. This article is full of adventure. It has the monster kidnapping a bride, carrying her partway up a mountain and then discarding her, fighting with dogs, barely escaping, and then running along the backs of cattle. Yeah, I said that right. Running along the backs of cattle. Let me read this part. A strange scene indeed. 4 or 5 days after this, Souser Ryan was rounding up a herd of 490 head of big beef steers away out on the divide. Suddenly there was a stampede. The cowboys stood up in their stirrups and saw something away over in the midst of the wild, surging herd, something that took away their breath. At first, It looked as if a naked giant swinging a long club over his head was running along over the backs of the mad cattle. Occasionally it looked as if the monster paused for a moment to execute a pow-sow or a war dance on the rump or shoulders of a bucking Mexican bull. It was not long before they recognized the wild man of the Hondo, and they put spurs to their ponies and circled about, making an effort to mill the frightened cattle. When the cattle began to circle, the wild man appeared to have dropped straddle of one of the steers. Pretty soon this steer was thrown on the outside of the circle, and then the wild devil stood up on the animal's back. Never did mortal eyes behold such a sight. It was an enormous Mexican steer, 5 or 6 years old, with long horns that would measure 7 or 8 feet from tip to tip. The animal was mad with terror and making the wildest acrobatic efforts to get rid of its tormentor. At one instant, it got a few yards away from the herd, and a shepherd dog took after it. The monster bent over and seized the dog by one of its hind legs. Now there was a scene for an artist. The steer plunged into the herd, and the naked colossus sprang to his feet on the animal's back, and swinging the dog around over his head, he poured forth a series of wild yells that made the cattle frantic. They broke away from the cowboys and made the earth tremble beneath their mad stampede. In the cloud of dust, the cowboys soon lost sight of the monster, and everybody hoped that he had been trampled to death beneath the feet of the wild cattle. Well, of course they had no such luck. The wild man was fully alive, out there with his club. The story ends with the wild man crashing a party for Mexican Independence Day and throwing the body of one of the cowboys into the party. Of course, the women faint, the women cry, and the men head out to track this creature down, revolvers in hand. What does one make of a story like this? I mean, I can certainly see in my mind a herd of cattle. I've seen cattle. But then I try to think of a 7, 8, or 9 foot being dancing on top of these cattle, wielding a huge 5 or 6 foot club in his hand, screaming wildly. Yeah, that would be frightening. I have spent a lot of time out in Kerrville, out in the hill country of Texas. I've climbed Enchanted Rock and hiked through that entire area. I never did see this particular fellow, but if I had, I guess I would hope that he would leave his club at home. Some of these articles bring information to the table that I've never read anywhere else. So I thought it would be a good idea to put at least one article in its entirety in this podcast. Here to bring you that article, fresh from the Mugwump School of Broadcasting, my brother, Beauregard Hermanson. Beau, the microphone is yours.
From the Omaha Sunday, B News, 13 May, 1934. Town shudders as ape-man scare is revived. The weird reports of the mysterious long-haired ape-man that have been said to live in the caves of the Rocky Mountains in western Canada were interestingly revived recently. The newest reported appearance comes from a little settlement in British Columbia, about 60 miles east of Vancouver. 3 times lately it is claimed that residents of Harrison Mills have seen one of the hairy ape men from the neighboring wilderness. The latest definite statement came from Frank Dan, a mill worker who describes the visitor as a large, hairy, naked, wild man, a giant in size and ferocious in appearance. When Mr. Dan saw him, the creature was prowling on all 4s near his home. Since his reported experience, all the homes in the little Canadian mill town have been locked and barred at night, and children have been closely guarded. Aroused late one night by the continual barking of his dog, Dan went out into the backyard to investigate. It was a bright moonlight night, and as he stepped outside of the gate, he clearly saw the wild man, crouching near the fence. He stood erect as he approached it, and when Dan saw the giant size of the creature and heard it snarling, he dashed back into the house to get a rifle. When he came out again, the wild man had disappeared. For a number of years, British Columbia residents have caught occasional glimpses of wild men who are believed by Indians of the Chehalis tribe to be the survivors of a ferocious animal-like race which lived in the mountains. These wild men are frequently mentioned in Indian tribal lore and are referred to as Sasquatch, or the hairy mountain men. They live, according to the Indians, in caves and caverns on the borders of rocky mountain lakes, and are savage when cornered and fight like animals. Some of them, the Indians say, have long animal fangs instead of eye teeth, and use these fangs to deadly advantage when fighting animals or humans. They live like animals, eating raw flesh and vegetable roots, and seldom approach the centers of civilization. They have always been greatly feared by the Indians. Just a few weeks prior to Dan's encounter with the wild man, a British Columbia hunter startled Harrison Mills residents with a story of how he had met a hairy, ape-like creature in the woods while he was returning from a day's duck shooting. "I was carrying a bag of ducks when I met this man-monkey," the hunter said. "It was so close to me I did not have a chance to use my gun or make a run for it. The monster snatched the ducks away from me and darted into the woods. And though I searched for it some time afterwards, I was unable to find any trace of it. It was like a hairy man, was completely nude, and was much taller than any man I have ever seen. I was so frightened I suppose I wasn't very observant and didn't notice many details about it. He didn't speak or make any sound, just grabbed the ducks and dashed into the woods." A few days later, after Dan related the story of his encounter with the wild man, a report came from an Indian fisherman who said that while he was fishing on the Harrison River, not far from the mill town, he was attacked by one of the wild men. The Indian was gliding along in his canoe when, without warning, he said a rock was thrown from the top of the cliff, plunging into the water within a foot of his canoe. The boat was almost swamped. The startled Indian glanced upwards and asserts that he saw a huge hairy man bounding down the side of the cliff like some wild animal and carrying under his arm another huge rock. As the Indian struggled to swing his canoe out into the midstream, the wild man paused and hurled the second rock at him, missing the canoe by mere inches. On missing the boat a second time, the monster swung his arms wildly and ran down to the edge of the river, snarling and half shouting, half screaming. The frightened Indian reported. The Indian paddled away as quickly as he could and returned to his reservation to tell his terrifying tale. Although perhaps a dozen of the wild men have been reported to have been seen during the past 20 years in British Columbia, only one of them has ever been kept in captivity, known as Kil-ith-ka. This ape-man was supposed to have been discovered as an infant in the mountains and was brought up by an Indian couple on the Chehalis Reserve as their own child. It developed all the characteristics of the dreaded mountain men and was much feared by the other Indians, although its foster parents continued to care for it until they died. For many years, Kil-ith-ka occupied a kennel on the reserves, living with the dogs owned by the Indians. It never learned to walk on two legs, but spent its entire life on all fours, eating its meals out of a dish placed on the ground. Kil-ith-ka also developed two long fangs instead of eye teeth, and used them as weapons when threatened by dogs or teased by Indian children. The general opinion in the neighborhood was that the monster was the child of Indian parents, born during the time that the Indian villagers were terrified by a series of attacks by ravenous mountain wolves, and that the mother's fright during the prenatal period had marked the child as half man and half animal. But this old-fashioned idea that the fright of a mother can mark an unborn child has long since been exploded by science. Scientists who visited the creature concluded that it was the child of an Indian mother and one of the long list of strange human monsters which history has recorded. The infant might have been deserted by its parents and picked up by members of another tribe, or the family that took care of the creature might have been its own parents. The skull of the unfortunate is now in the Vancouver Museum. Some of the older Indians say that they can recall the days when the hairy mountain men were seen fairly frequently, and when every Indian encampment kept watch for attacks by these ferocious, prowling creatures. In the records of early British Columbia settlers, too, there are numerous references to strange, wild creatures that lived in the mountain caves and ate the flesh of other animals.
Okay, let's go back and just examine that a wee bit further. Okay, so we have a an infant found in the wilderness, raised by this tribe, by a particular couple, raised as their own. It never learned to walk. It grew fangs. It was examined by scientists. And by the time it died, the skull was placed in the Vancouver Museum. I wonder if I went to the Vancouver Museum and said, excuse me, I'd really like to see the skull of Kil-ith-Ka, if they would just look at me like I was crazy, or perhaps some amazingly intelligent and gentle docent would usher me to the back. We'd go find some huge cabinets that have been untouched for years, covered in dust, and there would be a drawer with the skull of Kil-ith-Ka. But I doubt it. It's a story unlike any other story that I've read, and I find it pretty darn fascinating. I guess I like the idea of the skull of Kil-ith-Ka sitting quietly and serenely in a museum vault, waiting for someone to come along to find and reveal its secrets. Man, I have a huge pile of these old stories in front of me. You know, I'm not in great voice today. I have some allergies that are acting up. So I believe I'm going to make this a 2-part episode. So next week, tune in again, and we will go through many more of these old articles concerning what I believe to be Bigfoot. One of these articles is the most exuberant article of this type that I've ever seen. It covers in great depth the Sasquatch tribe of Canada and how they are, again, 7-8 feet tall, covered in hair, and pretty much terrorize all of the other tribes around them. Interesting topic. I do not for a second believe that all of these stories are fabricated. I believe that a large portion of them are reporting true events, something that really happened. I think people are bad witnesses. I think journalists tend to exaggerate. But I do believe that these old articles, once again, are decent evidence that something is going on that we do not fully understand. Okay, until next week, this is Vic Hermanson signing out. Thanks for listening. Okay, it's time for all the formal ending stuff. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson, with help from Boudreaux, of course. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. Our social media presence will be expanded in the next few weeks, but for now, if you want to get in touch with us, please just write to trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. We need your stories. As you can see, we are just a wee bit different here. If you have a story that you have thought is too odd to share anywhere else, please call us. Please send it to us. We want it, we need it, and we will present it with respect and understanding. Thanks again.
Vic Hermanson surprises me. He has no natural talent at this, is interested in very unusual topics, and today he didn't even sound all that great. Yet he persists in cranking out these podcasts. That's sort of amazing. How about throwing the poor dog a bone and giving a good rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts? If you ever tell him I asked you to do this, I will disrupt the flow of electrons in every cell of your body.